Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
You know, when we talk about the civil rights movement, we always think about what went down in the South.
Right.
Right. All those marches and the fight to overturn Jim Crow laws.
Mm-hmm.
But today we're diving deep into a chapter that often gets kind of overlooked.
Okay.
The SCLC's 1966 campaign in Chicago.
Interesting.
And it wasn't just, a change of location.
Yeah.
It was a whole different kind of battlefield.
In what way?
Well, in Chicago, the fight wasn't about, legally enforced segregation anymore.
Right.
It was about something way deeper.
Okay.
And way harder to actually tackle, I think.
Like what?
Economic inequality.
Oh.
And this thing called de facto segregation.
De facto segregation.
It's like segregation that happens just because of, the way things are.
Okay.
Not because of actual laws. It's
Okay.
where people can afford to live.
Yeah.
And what kind of opportunities they have access to.
Gotcha.
And that's where our source for this deep dive comes in really handy. This episode of the Mr. Hutchings History podcast,
Right.
they unpack this whole campaign
Yeah.
and its impact in such an interesting way. So basically what we're trying to figure out today is, did King's nonviolent tactics that worked so well, down south,
Right.
did they really work against the totally different obstacles they faced up in Chicago?
Interesting question.
Right.
Yeah. To understand that, though, I think we need to lay out the unique challenges in Chicago at that time.
Okay.
You had this politically active Black community.
Yeah.
But they were trapped in these segregated neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't about, overcoming laws.
Right.
It was about access
Yeah.
to better housing
Yeah.
and economic opportunities.
Makes sense.
And that required a totally different approach.
So that's where Operation Breadbasket comes in.
Operation Breadbasket.
Yeah. You know that SCLC program to fight economic inequality?
Oh, right.
And after King left Chicago,
Yeah.
Jesse Jackson took the lead, organizing all these boycotts
Yeah.
and demanding better jobs for Black workers.
Okay.
And you know what? They actually saw some real wins,
Really?
like real tangible changes.
That's amazing.
Companies started hiring more Black employees.
Wow.
It felt like a real victory.
I bet. Operation Breadbasket is definitely a success story in this whole thing.
Totally agree. But when it comes to housing,
Yeah.
things get a lot more complicated.
How so?
The SCLC, they set their sights on integrating housing.
Okay.
They even got Mayor Daley to agree to a plan
Wow.
after they threatened these massive citywide marches.
Oh, wow.
But
But there's always a but, isn't there?
right, it's never that simple.
Never. This agreement, it's often called a paper victory.
What does that even mean?
Well, it was a promise on paper, but no real way to make it happen.
Oh, I see.
It looked like a win on the surface,
Right.
but didn't really lead to the big changes people were hoping for.
The podcast actually mentions some historians, Anderson and Pickering.
Go ahead.
They say Daley's promises were more about symbolism than real change.
Interesting.
And they talk about this $4 million federal grant.
$4 million.
Yeah, sounds like a lot.
It does.
But it didn't really have the impact everyone thought it would.
I see.
And all this lack of, real change
Oh,
when
yeah.
it came to housing, it created this feeling of disillusionment among the Black community.
Really?
The podcast even quotes someone saying they felt like the SCLC had sold out.
Wow. That's a strong statement.
Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about housing either.
Oh.
The source mentions that even SCLC staff, they were having a hard time mobilizing Chicago's Black residents.
Oh, wow.
There was a lot of infighting going on between different leaders.
Oh,
And there was this sense of hopelessness.
really?
People were starting to lose faith in the SCLC's whole approach.
So what happened then?
Well, that's where we see this kind of ripple effect of the disillusionment.
Okay.
It was actually a key factor in the rise of the Black Power movement.
The Black Power movement.
Yeah. You can think of it this way.
All right.
Chicago's failed attempts at real reform,
Yeah.
they kind of created this breeding ground
Wait.
for a new kind of activism.
Interesting.
One that focused on self-determination, economic control, by Black people themselves,
Right.
and just overall Black empowerment.
Makes sense.
So you see how one event can totally change the way people think.
They do.
And there's this historian, Stephen Tuck.
Okay.
He actually argues that in a way the SCLC,
Yeah.
They unintentionally paved the way for Black power.
Really?
Yeah, by not quite delivering on their promises.
Wow.
It's like sometimes setbacks can lead to more radical change.
That's a fascinating thought.
Right. The Chicago campaign really forced people to rethink, nonviolent protests
Right.
when you're up against such huge inequality.
Right.
And remember, we're not talking about changing laws anymore.
No.
It was about changing the whole way society worked.
The podcast actually outlines 4 different ways historians have looked at this Chicago campaign.
Oh, really? 4 different ways.
Yeah, it's amazing how different each perspective is.
That's so cool.
It reminds us that history isn't just facts.
Right.
It's about how we interpret them and asking the right questions.
Like what kinds of questions?
Well, for example, the social history perspective
Okay.
asks, what were the lasting effects on the community?
It makes sense.
Even beyond the big wins.
I see.
Were there like ripple effects that we still see today?
Ooh, I like that. Then there's the political history view, right? That says those tactics that worked so well in the South,
Yeah.
the marches, the sit-ins, they just weren't effective against Chicago's political machine.
The political machine. Explain that.
You know that powerful network of people
Yeah.
who control a city's politics, often corrupt. They maintain their power through favors, sometimes even intimidation.
I see.
It was so different from those openly racist laws down south.
Yeah. It's not like comparing apples and oranges.
Totally different strategies.
Exactly. And then there's the revisionist perspective,
Okay.
which sees Chicago as this turning point for King himself.
Interesting.
It argues that this campaign shifted his thinking towards economic justice
Oh.
and the idea of redistributing wealth.
That is a turning point.
Right. And then finally, you have the Black power perspective,
Okay.
which criticizes the SCLC for not making lasting change.
Yeah.
And they see the campaign as evidence that self-reliance was the only way forward.
Wow. So many different ways to look at it.
It really makes you think.
Which perspective resonates with you the most?
That's a good question.
It really reveals your own, biases and assumptions
For sure.
about how social change actually happens.
Absolutely.
Now, going back to Jesse Jackson. Yeah.
After King left, he really took charge of Operation Breadbasket
Yeah.
and got some real wins in terms of Black employment.
That's great.
Here comes a but.
Right. Even with those wins.
Yeah.
There was still this disappointment about housing
Right.
simmering under the surface.
Yeah.
And the racial divide in Chicago didn't just magically disappear.
Of course not.
It really highlights how tough it was to take those strategies from the South
Yeah.
and apply them to the North.
For sure.
Because in Chicago, the battles weren't as clear-cut
Right.
as, desegregating buses and lunch counters.
Yeah.
We're talking about deep economic and housing inequality.
Way more complex.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, tell me.
It seems like the SCLC,
Yeah.
by raising expectations and then not fully delivering,
Right.
might have accidentally fueled a backlash
A backlash from who?
from white Chicagoans.
Oh.
They started to see these activists as troublemakers, and that just made the racial divide even worse.
It's almost tragic.
Yeah.
How even the best intentions can backfire.
And this whole experience seems connected to King's later work
Right.
with the Poor People's Campaign,
Right.
where he really shifted his focus to economic justice.
Interesting.
Maybe Chicago wasn't a failure at all, but a crucial step in his own development as a leader,
Yeah.
pushing him to tackle even bigger issues.
So was Chicago a failure?
Or a necessary turning point.
That's the question, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Was it a setback, or was it like a necessary step in a much bigger struggle?
Yeah.
I feel like we've learned so much about this campaign,
Me too.
but the biggest question is still out there, I think.
What's that?
What can we learn from all of this?
Right.
What does it tell us about fighting for social and economic justice today?
You hit the nail on the head.
I mean, one thing that really struck me is that even with the best intentions, you can have these unintended consequences.
Oh, totally.
Like, we saw how raising expectations and then not being able to meet them,
Yeah.
it can actually cause a backlash.
Absolutely. And even more division.
And it just underscores how important it is to really get the context.
Right.
What worked in the South with those very specific legal battles.
Against segregation,
Exactly. It didn't necessarily work up north.
where things were more about economics and social systems.
So how do we apply that to today?
That's the question, isn't it?
I mean, are we making those same mistakes?
It's possible.
Are we fighting the right battles but using the wrong strategies?
I think those are questions we all need to be thinking about.
And the Chicago campaign offers some valuable lessons.
Like what?
Well, first, it shows us that creating real change, system-wide change, it's really hard.
It is.
It's not just about passing laws.
Right.
It's about changing hearts and minds.
And changing those systems of power.
Yeah. That we don't even realize are there a lot of the time.
It's
like you can trim a tree's branches all you want.
Yeah.
But if the roots are still messed up, it's not going to really thrive.
You got to get to the root of the problem.
Not just fix the symptoms.
Right.
And this brings us to another big lesson.
What's that?
Unity.
Oh, yeah.
And building coalitions.
So important.
You know, the Chicago campaign was really held back by all the divisions in the Black community.
Right.
And the lack of support from white allies.
And sadly, that's something we're still dealing with.
Think about all the big issues we face today.
Like
climate change, poverty, racial injustice.
Totally.
None of those can be solved by just one group working alone.
Nope.
It takes collective action.
Collaboration.
And a willingness to, put our differences aside.
For the greater good.
And that takes strong leadership, doesn't it?
It really does.
We talked about how Jesse Jackson stepped up.
After King left.
And had success with Operation Breadbasket.
He did.
But there were criticisms, too,
of the
SCLC.
Like what?
That they weren't always in tune with the needs of the community.
The community they were trying to help.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
You need those leaders with vision.
Yeah, to inspire and mobilize.
Yes, but you also need leaders who really understand the community.
Who are in touch with the needs of the people they serve.
Right.
And who are accountable.
Yes. Accountability is so important.
Because when leaders make promises they can't keep,
yeah.
It just destroys trust.
Absolutely.
It creates that disillusionment we talked about.
It does.
And that goes for anyone in power.
For sure.
Politicians, CEOs, community organizers.
It doesn't matter.
Accountability matters.
Big time.
It's about earning that trust.
And keeping it.
Which is so easily broken.
It really is.
So looking back at the Chicago campaign, with all its ups and downs, what stands out to you as the biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest thing for me is that it's a reminder.
Of what?
That the struggle for justice,
Yeah.
it never really ends. It's not just a chapter in a history book. It's a story that we're all still writing.
Wow. I like
And those lessons from Chicago.
Yeah.
The need for systemic change. Understanding the root causes.
Yeah.
Building bridges and working together.
All of it.
Those are all just as relevant today as they were back then.
Yeah, it's like we're retracing their steps, you know?
It is.
Learning from their struggles and their victories and, yeah, even their mistakes.
The Chicago campaign shows us that progress isn't always a straight line. You know?
Yeah.
There will be setbacks, unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Even times when we wonder if we're really making any difference at all.
But we can't give up, can we?
We can't.
Giving up is not an option.
The fight for justice takes persistence, resilience, and a willingness to adapt.
And learn as we go.
Exactly. And Chicago shows us, even with all its complexities, change is possible.
Even when it seems impossible.
Even then.
It gives me hope.
Me too.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all this?
I hope they realize how nuanced history really is. It's easy to look back and judge.
I know, right?
But we have to remember those people.
Yeah.
They were living in a totally different time.
With different information.
Different pressures.
It's about empathy, isn't it?
It is.
It's trying to understand where they were coming from.
Even if we don't agree with their choices.
Exactly.
And that same empathy should guide us today.
You mean in our own actions?
Yeah, we need to be open to different viewpoints, acknowledge our own biases.
And work together.
To build a better world.
A more just world.
For everyone.
Because at the end of the day,
yeah,
the fight for social and economic justice, it's not about us versus them.
No, it's about creating a society where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Regardless of race.
Background.
Zip code.
It's about opportunity for all.
Well said.
Thank you.
So there you have it, folks.
Our deep dive into the SCLC's 1966 Chicago campaign.
A story with inspiration.
Challenges.
And so many lessons for all of us.
Who want to make a difference.
So as you go about your day,
yeah,
keep those lessons in mind.
Ask yourself,
what can I do to contribute to a more just and equitable world?
Well, how can I be part of the solution?
Because the fight for justice never ends.
And we all have a role to play.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.